Just finishing my lunch. Levi from Urban Roots. Why are you here? You want to talk about compost? Because that's what I'm doing with that apple core. Welcome back to another tutorial. We're just having fun today, but today we're going to be talking about compost. While compost is a great waste diversion strategy for throwing your leftovers into at the end of the day, it's also one of the keys for improving your soil fertility in your garden or backyard farm. So what we have here is some waste, which includes top of a pineapple, the apple core I just finished, eggshell, some of the paperless to-go containers, and we've created this pile. So we pick up compost from about 150 homes. Each week, most homes fill up a bucket about this size, and then we're building these piles. And in a little while, we're going to show you how to build one in your backyard, but we want to talk just for a second about what we see happen in these piles. So this one was built with a mix of feedstock like the ones we had, as well as browns. And you can see that even though the pile's a few days old, it's still at about 120 degrees right now. The piles will get pretty high, up to about 160 degrees, and it'll drop down, and then we'll turn them. So this is what our piles start out looking like, and you can see probably in the front that you can still see a lot of organic material that hasn't broken down. But just a couple weeks later, it'll start to look like this pile. So it's gotten a little bit darker, and you probably can't see as much uncomposted organic material, and like I mentioned, it gets pretty warm pretty quick. A few weeks later, we'll turn it again using just a pitchfork, and it looks like this one here. You can see it's quite a bit smaller, and compost will lose about 2/3 of its biological mass to heat. So these piles are staying pretty hot, and each time we turn them, they get hot again and cool down. And finally, we'll end up with a pile like this one over here. So this is pretty consistent finished material. You can see there's a few worms in there. There's one. Other than wood chips or sticks, most of it's broken down, and this is the same. This pile was originally that size and has been turned about 4 times, and this is what we'll end up with. One quick note before we show you how to build a pile is regarding these things. You might recognize this as the compostable cups. They sometimes have a green stripe and they say 100% compostable. We've been getting a lot of questions about these from student groups and visitors, and while these say compostable, the hottest our backyard piles will get is about 170 degrees, and that's a really active pile. Most of these are food grade tested, so they won't break down until about 200 degrees. So sometimes they'll say on them, compostable only in industrial facilities. What that means is we can have these piles in here, and it'll take years before they break down. So while they say compostable, that's not entirely accurate if you're doing backyard composting. The paper cups will still break down because they're carbonaceous, but these plant-based polymers, they really don't work. So something to keep an eye out if you have a challenge with these in your piles. Why don't we pause here and you can come on over, we'll show you how to build a pile. So when we're building our backyard compost, there's really 4 things that we like to consider: construction, ingredients, moisture, and management. To start with construction, it can be as simple or as complex as you want to make it. We often like to use pallets, and so what we have here are a series of bays. You can build 1 bay or 2 bays. We also see people that like to use cement retaining blocks, the big concrete masonry units. We can also do it with green tea stakes and chicken wire, as long as airflow can get in, but that it's managed. And we don't have a lot of issues with pests because of the recipe that we use, and we'll explain that more. So this is an active pile behind us here. The construction, again, is our pallets up against a fence here. And in terms of the ingredients, we always want a mix of what's called browns and greens. Our browns are anything that generally are brown, so that looks like cardboard or newspaper, old leaves, sometimes sawdust, although we want to be sparing with that, mature plant material, anything that's starting to look brown. And we want a good mix of browns to our greens, and our greens are what we also call our immature. And that's all of our feedstock. That includes things like onions and apple cores and eggshells. So we want a good mix of those 2 things, which will help mitigate against smells or algal growth or anything like that. So in this pile right here, you can see that we're going to take our feedstocks, and this is collected. Oh, that's gross. That's moldy. We got a bunch of old peppers in there. Looks like someone had some rotten peppers. Then we're going to use our browns, and here we use straw as a lot of our browns. Now if we just left this out here, we'd have all sorts of issues with pests, but we're going to just layer this over, and actually that's going to help the decomposition process start to happen pretty quickly. It's also going to protect a little bit against any sort of pest issues. This is called lasagna composting, and there are different techniques. There's cold composting, hot composting, bokashi, which is a fermented style, or even vermicomposting, which is including using mostly worms. This is hot composting, where our piles are getting really warm and we're building them, and we find that that's the technique that's worked the best for us, but be sure to try out different techniques and find out what works for you. So after we have construction and our ingredients, then we're looking at our moisture levels. So like all living things, if we just leave this and it's dry, those biota and microorganisms won't start to get active. So we want to make sure and add water. And that means in the dry season, we're sometimes watering our compost piles, but sometimes in the wet season, we're actually going to cover it up with a tarp. And some of that is just getting to know and paying attention to it. If it starts to smell, it probably either has too many greens or too much moisture, or if it seems like it's not doing anything, it probably has too many browns and it's probably too dry. Again, like with everything, there's a little bit of art and a little bit of science, but pay attention to it and you'll notice a lot. And sometimes if it seems like it's not doing much, what you want to do is turn your compost piles. So we'll go from this pile to this pile, and you can see all the way down again into the finished bins over there. And that will be what our finished material looks like. And that's kind of our ongoing maintenance for our piles, which is the last thing to consider, is we like to use a pitchfork. And a pitchfork is just really ideal for getting in there and turning it. So even if you only have one bin, you can get in there occasionally and kind of turn it up, and you can see some of the steam that starts to come out of this pile, and there's worms there, and that just helps to activate and reanimate all those biota in the pile. Eventually, when we're done with it, if you want to screen it, we have a screener that's a 1/4 inch fabric mesh that we run it through. Then we're able to use that for our garden beds. There's a lot to learn about composting. We have a lot of fun, and we compost about 50,000 pounds of food waste a year here. If it's too small and you're just on your own, see if a neighbor or someone down the street or a community association wants to do it together on a kind of a communal scale. It's really a great material, and it's actually a lot of fun. So thanks for checking us out. Be sure to subscribe. We'll see you back here next time.